All right, let's dive right in, shall we? Today, we're tackling a topic that's got the whole world watching. The Panama Canal and the logistical logjam it's facing.
Oh, yeah. It's a pretty big deal. You've got these massive cargo ships, some of them longer than the Eiffel Tower, stuck in a queue, all because of a drought.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. This tiny strip of water, the Panama Canal, handles something like 6% of global trade. It's a vital shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific.
And it all hinges on fresh water.
Right, not just seawater. They use fresh water from Gatun Lake to operate these giant locks that lift the ships up and over the land.
Exactly. And those locks use an incredible amount of water. Every single time a ship passes through, it takes a whopping 52 million gallons.
52 million. Wow, that's more water than I use in a year, probably a decade. So with this drought hitting Panama,
Gatun Lake's water levels have plummeted. They're at a 4-year low, and that means trouble for the canal.
so what happens when there's not enough water to operate the locks?
Well, things get backed up. Big time. Back in August, there were over 200 ships stuck in a queue, just waiting to get through. And the number of ships that can pass through each day has been slashed almost in half.
Wow, so instead of things moving smoothly, it's like a global traffic jam.
Exactly. And that's causing major ripples throughout the global supply chain.
So what are shipping companies doing about this? Surely they can't just sit and wait for the rain to come back.
Well, some are choosing to go the long way around through the Suez Canal.
Suez, isn't that way long?
It is. It adds significant time and fuel costs to the journey.
So why would anyone choose that over the Panama Canal?
It comes down to predictability. Even with the extra distance and expense, the Suez Canal might be a safer bet right now. At least they know they can get through, unlike the Panama Canal, where they could end up stuck for weeks.
So it's a gamble either way.
Exactly. And then there are those looking at even more radical solutions. They're calling them dry canals.
Dry canals. That sounds almost counterintuitive. How can a canal be dry?
Well, think of it as a land-based route across Central America. You know how goods arrive at a port and then get loaded onto trains to reach the other side of the country?
Yeah, like a land bridge.
Right. The U.S. already has a few of those. These dry canals are basically just larger-scale versions of that concept.
So instead of ships floating through a canal, we'd have containers zipping across on trains.
That's the idea, and different countries have different visions for how to pull this off. Mexico, for example, has been revitalizing their Isthmus of Tehuantepec rail route. They're hoping that with some upgrades, it could become a real alternative to the Panama Canal.
Interesting. So are these dry canals actually a realistic solution, or are we talking science fiction here?
Well, that depends. There are some experts who are pretty skeptical. They point to the enormous logistical challenges and the sheer cost of building and maintaining such massive infrastructure.
Yeah, it's not just about laying down some tracks, is it?
Definitely not. You've got engineering hurdles, environmental concerns, and the big question of whether it would actually be cheaper than traditional shipping routes. But then there's Zergotran, and that's a whole different ballgame.
Zergotran, that rings a bell. It's in Colombia, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
Imagine a 137-mile tunnel, completely underground, connecting Colombia's Pacific and Atlantic coasts.
A tunnel that long. That's even longer than the Panama Canal itself. What would they even use to transport goods through there? Donkeys with saddlebags full of coffee beans?
Not quite. Hold on to your hats because this is where it gets wild. They're talking about maglev trains specifically designed for cargo.
Maglev trains? You mean those futuristic trains that levitate and travel at crazy speeds underground? This is sounding more like a sci-fi movie every minute.
It does, doesn't it? But it's potentially revolutionary.
I have to admit, you've got me intrigued. Tell me more about this Zergotran project.
Well, it's still in the early stages, but the vision is pretty mind-blowing. They want to create this completely subterranean maglev railway, moving massive shipping containers across the country at incredible speeds. We're talking potentially under 30 minutes from one coast to the other.
30 minutes?
Yeah.
Seriously, that's faster than it takes me to get to the grocery store. How could they possibly move that much cargo that quickly?
Well, think about it. With a maglev system, there's no friction. So you can achieve these insanely high speeds. And by going underground, they bypass all the surface obstacles and minimize the environmental impact.
So it's like a high-speed underground freight subway. This Zergotran thing is definitely living up to a sci-fi vibe.
It is, isn't it? Of course, there are huge challenges digging that tunnel, developing the maglev technology on such a scale, and then there's the small matter of finding the billions of dollars to make it all happen. But this crisis with the Panama Canal has definitely put a spotlight on Zergotran and other alternative shipping routes.
It makes you wonder if this drought might be the push the world needs to really consider these alternatives, especially something as groundbreaking as Zergotran.
It very well could be. Remember what they say, necessity is the mother of invention. And as the Panama Canal continues to struggle, that pressure to find solutions will only grow.
So we've got this critical waterway in crisis, and the world is scrambling for answers. It's like a giant puzzle. And dry canals, especially this Zergotran idea, might be the missing pieces.
That's a great way to put it. The Panama Canal isn't going away anytime soon, but this drought has definitely thrown a wrench into the works of global trade, and it's forcing everyone to think outside the box.
So where do we go from here?
Well, let's dive a little deeper into the implications of all of this. Who are the winners and losers in this scenario? What are the potential downsides? And most importantly, what does it all mean for you, the listener? That's where things get really interesting. You know, this whole situation with the Panama Canal, it really does highlight how vulnerable global trade is. We've become so reliant on this one little choke point that a single drought can cause chaos everywhere.
Like putting all our eggs in one very fragile basket. So what's the impact on the actual companies trying to move their goods through all this?
Well, for shipping companies, it's a logistical nightmare. They're dealing with delays, rising costs, and just a ton of uncertainty around the Panama Canal.
It's interesting that you mentioned some companies are choosing the Suez Canal, but isn't that route much longer? Why would they opt for that?
It's a gamble either way, but for some, the Suez might be the lesser of two evils. Because even with the added mileage and fuel costs, it might still be cheaper and more predictable than risking weeks of delay in the Panama Canal queue.
So it's a trade-off between cost and certainty.
Precisely. And then there are the ripple effects to consider. These delays impact delivery schedules, factory production.
Right, because if raw materials can't get to the factories on time, it throws everything off.
Exactly. It's a domino effect. And it impacts everything from manufacturing to retail. It's not just about delays either. This whole situation has created a lot of volatility in global shipping, making, planning, and forecasting a nightmare for businesses.
So it's not as simple as just finding an alternative route. It's about navigating a whole new level of complexity.
That's exactly it. And that's what makes these dry canal projects so intriguing, like the one in Mexico, and especially that Zergotran concept we talked about. They offer a way to diversify shipping routes and build a system that's more resilient, less vulnerable to disruptions, whether it's droughts, political instability, or any other unforeseen events.
It sounds like a potential game changer. But let's be realistic here. Is something like Zergotran actually feasible? Digging a 137-mile tunnel, creating this massive underground maglev network, it all sounds incredibly challenging, not to mention expensive.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. It would be a monumental undertaking, both technically and financially. But here's where things get really interesting. Remember that article you shared about Colombia's push to boost its economy and attract foreign investment? Well, the folks behind Zergotran, they're pitching this as more than just a way to move cargo. They see it as a catalyst for economic transformation, creating jobs, stimulating innovation, and positioning Colombia as a leader in sustainable transport.
That's a pretty bold vision. They're not just trying to solve a shipping problem. They're aiming for a kind of economic leapfrog.
Exactly. And while there are plenty of skeptics, there are also some experts who believe this Panama Canal crisis might be the push needed to make Zergotran happen. With traditional shipping routes in such turmoil, investors might be more willing to take a chance on these bold, out-of-the-box solutions.
Like the saying goes, never let a good crisis go to waste. Even if Zergotran doesn't ultimately pan out, the fact that it's being seriously considered is pretty telling. It shows how much things are shifting in global trade.
I completely agree. There's a growing realization that we need more options. We need to think beyond those traditional sea lanes. Who knows? Maybe in a decade or two, we'll be talking about cargo speeding through underground tunnels on maglev trains or even sailing through the Arctic thanks to ice-free shipping lanes.
That would be a real paradigm shift. But let's bring it back to the present for a moment. What about the Panama Canal Authority? Are they just watching all this unfold, or are they taking any steps to address the drought situation?
They're not sitting idle, that's for sure. In fact, they've proposed a plan to dam the Rio Indio.
To create a new reservoir? That seems logical enough. What's the controversy there?
Well, imagine over 2,000 people being forced to relocate because of this new reservoir. That's the reality. So there's a lot of debate about whether the economic benefits of keeping the canal flowing outweigh the social and environmental costs of this massive project.
It's a tough question. On the one hand, you've got the global impact of the Panama Canal. But on the other hand, you've got the lives and livelihoods of people who would be directly affected by this dam.
It's a classic dilemma, no easy answers. And it really highlights the complex trade-offs involved in these large-scale infrastructure projects.
It seems like there are challenges and difficult decisions no matter which way you turn. So where do we go from here? What's the bottom line for all of us who rely on global trade, even if we don't always realize it?
Yeah, it's a real balancing act, finding that sweet spot between keeping global trade flowing and protecting the people and the environment.
It is. And, it brings up a point that we haven't really touched on yet. The role of climate change in all of this. We often think of global trade as this kind of abstract system, but it's very much tied to the physical world, to the weather even.
That's a great point. We've been talking about this drought like it's an isolated event. But what if it's not? What if this is a sign of things to come? I mean, scientists are predicting more extreme weather as the climate changes. Exactly. And it's not just droughts. Rising sea levels, stronger storms, changes in ocean currents, all of these things can disrupt shipping routes, damage ports, and really wreak havoc on the global supply chain. Remember that article about rising sea levels impacting coastal cities? Well, a lot of those cities are major shipping hubs.
Oh, wow. So the Panama Canal situation is like a glimpse into the kind of challenges climate change could pose for global trade down the line.
It's definitely a wake-up call. It highlights the urgent need to make our global trade systems more resilient, more adaptable.
Okay, so what can be done? It all sounds a bit overwhelming, but are there steps we can take to at least try to mitigate these risks?
Absolutely. It'll take a multi-pronged approach. Governments, shipping companies, and even consumers all have a role to play.
Let's break that down. What can governments do?
Well, they need to start thinking long-term. They need to invest in climate-resilient infrastructure. Things like stronger, more elevated ports that can withstand rising sea levels and stronger storms, and early warning systems for extreme weather, so shipping companies can adjust their routes and avoid major disruptions.
So it's about anticipating the problems and building in redundancies so we're not caught off guard.
Right. And beyond infrastructure, governments can also incentivize innovation in the shipping industry, encourage the development of more sustainable technologies, like those fuel-efficient ships we were talking about earlier.
Right. And what about the shipping companies themselves? What can they do?
Well, for one thing, they need to become a lot more flexible and adaptable. They need to be willing to shift routes, adjust schedules, and experiment with new technologies and approaches.
Yeah.
It's a more volatile landscape now, so they need to be able to adapt quickly.
So instead of being like those massive cargo ships trying to stay on a fixed course, they need to be more like speedboats, able to weave around obstacles.
I like that analogy. And they also need to think beyond just the bottom line. They need to invest in long-term sustainability. Remember those alternative fuels we talked about? They're becoming more and more viable, and companies that embrace those now will be better prepared for the future, literally and figuratively.
It sounds like they need to move from just reacting to crises to actively planning for a future that's a lot more uncertain.
Exactly. And, it's not just governments and corporations. Consumers have a role to play as well.
Oh, right. I almost forgot about us regular folks. But what can we realistically do? It feels like this is all so big, so out of our control.
Every little bit counts. You can be more mindful about where the things you buy come from, how far they've traveled. You can support companies that prioritize sustainability. Even consider reducing your overall consumption. These actions all contribute to a more sustainable, more resilient global trade system.
So it's recognizing that even our small individual choices are connected to this bigger picture of global trade and the impact it has on the planet.
Exactly. And, this whole Panama Canal situation really brings that interconnectedness home.
It has been a fascinating discussion, and a bit unsettling, too, to be honest. Seeing how this drought in Panama has had these ripple effects across the world, and how it could even reshape the future of global trade.
It's definitely a reminder that the world is more connected than we often realize, and that the choices we make, whether individually or collectively, have an impact that extends far beyond what we might see immediately.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored this Panama Canal crisis. We talked about dry canals and the challenges climate change poses for global trade. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little inspiring.
Absolutely. The future of global trade is still being written, and we all have a role to play in shaping that story.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll be enjoying our morning coffee, delivered fresh from Colombia via some super-fast underground maglev train. Marveling at how the world found a way to adapt and innovate in the face of adversity.
Until then, keep those thinking caps on and stay curious.
And that's a wrap on today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.